In Bayview, Maine, the sea woke early, exhaling fog that clung to the houses like memory. Boats rocked gently at the docks as if nodding in sleep. It was a place that measured time by tide and tide alone. No billboards, no high-rises, only the rhythm of wind on water and the creak of withered wood. At the edge of this quiet world lived Jack Morgan, a man shaped by salt and solitude. At 67, he moved like the boats he loved, steady, purposeful, and a little slower than he used to be. Jack's world was small by design. He woke at 4 each morning, filled a dented thermos with bitter coffee, and padded down to the pier in boots softened by age and repetition. His home was a modest clapboard cottage with paint faded by sea wind and time. Inside, a photograph of his father, taken the day they christened the boat, hung slightly crooked in the hallway, just where Jack liked it. His heart had grown quieter in recent years. The weariness of age, the slow pull of old grief, and the ache of unspoken regrets had settled into his bones. But on this morning, there was something different. Elliot was home. Elliot, his son, who had gone off into the world of meetings and deadlines, had returned for a rare visit. It had been planned as a simple thing, a morning on the water, a reminder of where they came from. The Mayflower, the old family boat, waited at the dock, its hull worn and patched but still loyal. It had once belonged to Jack's father, and Jack had spent more years on it than on land. Each board carried the weight of generations, and every dent held a memory. There was no luxury here, no technology, just ropes, nets, and a man's quiet dignity. Elliot wasn't a fisherman. He wore the sea awkwardly now, the same way he wore his father's silence. But that morning, he rose early and met Jack by the boat. They loaded the old cooler with sandwiches, filled the thermoses, and pushed off with the tide, cutting through the mist like a breath held too long. Out on the water, the world fell away. There were no phones, no engines roaring, only the hush of sea against hull, the cry of distant gulls, and the rhythm of the old man at work. Jack moved through familiar rituals, checking the lines, scanning the water, adjusting the engine. Elliot watched, remembering things he hadn't thought about in years. The quiet had weight, but it was a good weight, filled with something almost forgotten. Then came the sound. Low at first. A thump of bass too sharp for the morning stillness. It grew louder, cutting through the fog. A shape emerged, white, gleaming, loud. A luxury yacht, out of place in these waters, sped into the bay like it was fleeing something. Music pounded from hidden speakers. Lights flashed despite the daylight. Aboard, people laughed and took pictures, glasses raised to skies they didn't understand. The boat bore the name Venture in silver letters that caught what little sun broke through the mist. Jack turned instinctively, guiding the Mayflower to safer waters, but the yacht moved with reckless force. There was no hesitation, no adjustment. The two vessels were never meant to meet, but in that moment, history met money, silence met noise, and caution met carelessness. The impact was brutal. The Mayflower cracked like an old bone. Wood splintered and scattered like feathers. Jack and Elliot were thrown into the cold Atlantic with barely time to breathe. The water swallowed them, choked them, held them down before releasing them like discarded tools. The yacht surged ahead, never slowing. Its wake tossed debris into the air. A broken oar floated past Elliot's arm. Jack surfaced, his head bleeding, clutching a seat cushion that had once belonged to his father's favorite spot. They made it to shore, wet, shivering, cut and bruised, but alive. The Mayflower did not. What little remained washed in over the next hour, rope, splintered planks, Jack's cap soaked in seawater and clinging to the sand like it had tried to return on its own. From the beach, Jack saw the Venture moored casually at a private dock not 100 yards away. The music still played. The laughter had not stopped. There were cameras now, someone filming a promotional clip, a luxury brand perhaps. On the upper deck stood a man in pressed linen, holding a tall glass as if it were a crown. Kevin Hartford. The name was known to anyone who paid attention to real estate headlines or quarterly earnings. Young, rich, connected. The kind of man who didn't need to check his wake or apologize when he cut through another person's world. He looked across the water once, but not at Jack. Not at the wreckage. Not at the damage done. He smiled for a photo. Toasted the air. Then turned away. Jack stood on the edge of everything he had lost. The boat was gone. The memories tied to it had been scattered like leaves in a storm. The life he had built slowly, year after year, had been crushed in a moment by a stranger who would forget the incident by dinner. The sand beneath his feet felt foreign, like he no longer belonged even to the shore. And Elliot, who had watched his father bend but never break, now saw something he had never seen before. A man who could no longer find his footing. The days that followed drifted past in a haze of paperwork, appointments, and silence. The Coast Guard had taken their statements, taken photographs, filed reports. But there were no witnesses, not a single clear image of the collision. The fog had hidden the truth from every camera but the one Jack didn't know existed. For now, their story was just that, a story. Word spread around town, but words, Jack knew, did not rebuild boats. The Mayflower was declared a total loss. It hadn't been insured. Jack had meant to renew the policy after winter, but money had been tight, and the season had come late. 2 weeks earlier, the papers had sat on his desk and signed. Now, there was nothing left to insure. Without the boat, there was no work. Without work, there was no income. And without income, there was only the ticking clock of unpaid bills and the ache of failing health. Jack's heart condition, something he had carefully managed for years, began to speak louder. The pills he needed cost more than he could now afford. He stretched them, broke them in half, counted days and doses like a man measuring time by handfuls of sand slipping away. His energy faded. Sleep became fractured. The ocean, once his salvation, became a thing he viewed only from the window, unreachable. Elliot stayed longer than planned. He canceled meetings, postponed travel, pushed back deadlines. But he didn't know how to help. His world dealt in contracts and data. Here, in Bayview, the problems were older, slower, and heavier. He saw his father moving like a man 10 years older, each step weighted not just by injury but by humiliation. They visited a lawyer. The man skimmed the case, frowned, and explained the limits of maritime law. No arrest had been made. No charges filed. Without footage or independent testimony, it was Hartford's word against theirs. And Hartford, the lawyer said, had very expensive words. Jack nodded. He didn't argue. He simply stood and walked out of the office, the silence around him louder than any outburst could have been. Elliot followed, helpless. At home, Jack busied himself with small things, sorting tackle boxes, organizing rusted tools, adjusting nothing. The house felt colder. The rooms echoed with things left unsaid. The photograph of Jack's father on the wall seemed to tilt further, a small reminder of how quickly foundations shift. Elliot watched his father's hands, once so sure, now trembling. He watched him pour coffee into the same old thermos, though there was nowhere to go. He watched him walk to the pier some mornings, just to stand at the end of it and look out over the water like a man searching for a voice in the wind. That old blue thermos never left his grip. It had been his companion for decades. Now it held more than coffee. It held memory. It held silence. It held whatever strength Jack had left. Neighbors were kind in passing ways. Someone dropped off a casserole. Another brought kindling. But kindness, when it is offered quietly, is often easier to ignore. Jack remained polite, reserved, unwilling to accept too much. He had always given help, not received it. Elliot offered to buy a new boat. Jack refused. It wasn't pride exactly, it was something deeper, something rooted in his belief that some things could not be replaced by money. The Mayflower was not just a vessel. It had been built by his father's hands, maintained by his own. A new boat would only be a shadow of what was lost. And even if it came, what would it matter? His heart, his strength, his purpose, they had all gone down with the wreck. At night, Jack sat alone by the window, a blanket draped over his shoulders, the thermos cooling beside him. He listened to the ocean breathe. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, Hartford's yacht remained anchored, lit up like a hotel, untouched, unbothered. Justice, it seemed, did not drift with the tide. And there was the house. The mortgage hadn't been a concern when Jack worked. Now it loomed. Notices began to arrive, first in polite print, then with bolder fonts. Elliot offered help again. Jack declined again. The lines around his eyes deepened. He ate less, spoke less, slept less. Even the seagulls seemed to circle lower these days. Elliot, once a visitor, now stayed in his childhood bedroom. He looked through drawers filled with old tide charts and weather logs, pencil sketches of fishing spots, and photographs of fish long caught and eaten. He remembered early mornings when his father carried him aboard in sleep, wrapped in a blanket, waking to the rocking of the boat and the smell of salt and bait. That man, strong and focused, seemed so far from the one now drifting through his own life like a ghost. One morning, Elliot found Jack trying to fix an old reel that had no purpose anymore. His hands fumbled the line. The knot slipped. The silence between them stretched. It had taken only seconds for the Mayflower to break apart. But the damage didn't stop there. It crept inward, through pride, through identity, through everything Jack had built with calloused hands and quiet endurance. He had not just lost a boat. He had lost the compass that gave him direction. And Elliot, who had spent his life chasing a different tide, realized too late that some storms arrive without warning, and some men, when broken, do not cry out. They simply stop rebuilding. Two months later, the harbor had changed. Not just in appearance, but in atmosphere. Where silence once lingered like fog, now there were murmurs of respect and cautious hope. New signs had been installed along the marina, their bold letters marking zones for traditional fishing vessels, urging caution, reminding boaters to slow down in shared waters. For decades, these waters had been navigated by working hands, by fathers and sons rising before dawn. Now, they were finally being seen again, not as vacant blue space, but as sacred ground to those who called it home. Jack Morgan stood on the deck of a boat that wasn't the Mayflower, but didn't try to be. The Liberty Dawn was not a replica of the past, but a vessel built for what lay ahead. Fiberglass hull, radar system, insulated storage, reinforced rails. It was strong, precise, modern, and yet, when Jack ran his hand along the railing, it felt familiar. Not because of its design, but because of who stood beside him. Elliot had returned, not for a visit this time, not to escape the city for a week, but to begin again. He had resigned from his job, closed his apartment, packed up the life he had built elsewhere to return to the one he had grown from. The son who once walked away from tide charts and netting knots now reviewed them at dawn, his hands learning the rhythms his father had known for decades. He no longer wore a tie, but a windbreaker and sunburn. And he wore it well. Their first trip out on the Liberty Dawn was quiet. Not solemn, but steady. They packed the cooler with the same sandwiches, poured coffee into the same old thermos, still dented from years of use. Jack refused to replace it. Some things, he said, still work just fine. The ocean greeted them like an old friend, cool, constant, and waiting. The boat moved smoothly, its engine humming rather than rattling. Elliot adjusted the nets while Jack watched, allowing himself, for the first time in months, to feel not just useful again, but proud. Not of himself, but of the man his son had chosen to become. Not someone who escaped hardship, but one who came back when it mattered. The town watched too. Locals who had once offered only quiet glances now waved from the docks. The story of the wreck, and what followed, had spread, not as gossip, but as something deeper. A tale of injustice, yes, but also of resilience. The Coast Guard had issued an official statement, confirming fault and outlining new guidelines for coastal navigation. NOAA had published an article featuring Jack's knowledge of tide behavior and fish migration, calling him a legacy resource. A local paper printed a column simply titled "The Fisherman Who Stayed." Kevin Hartford's yacht still visited occasionally, though never at speed. Its pace had slowed, its route shifted. There were rumors he had been approached by military families who read about the incident, reminders that money could not insulate a man from consequence, not forever. He no longer waved from the deck. The community had responded too. Donations had arrived anonymously, one from a Boston-based foundation, another from a former service member who credited Jack with helping his brother at sea decades ago. But Jack never looked for the names. He believed in the act, not the recognition. That autumn, Elliot painted a name on a wooden plaque and hung it above the entrance to the harbor office, Heritage Waters. Beneath it, in smaller print, it read, "In honor of those who remember where they came from, and who they came back for." The Liberty Dawn returned to port that evening with its hold full and its heart full. Jack and Elliot sat on overturned buckets, sipping what was left in the thermos. The sky burned orange behind the trees. The pier was quiet except for the soft lapping of water and the cry of gulls circling home. Jack leaned back against the railing, his face weathered but peaceful. He no longer looked like a man who had lost everything. He looked like a man who had remembered what still mattered. That night, Elliot added a photograph to the hallway wall beside the crooked one of Jack's father. In the new photo, Jack stood at the helm of the Liberty Dawn, one hand on the wheel, one on his son's shoulder. Both were smiling. Both were looking forward. No medals were awarded. No headline screamed. But something in Bayview had changed forever. And it all began the moment one man chose not to curse the sea, but to wait beside it, trusting that kindness without question was enough.